Okay, so I'll go ahead and get started. If at any time you guys have a question, this is a collaborative process. I'm not here just dictating to you guys. If you have a question, please let me know. Somebody else in the room is probably thinking the same thing. I'm sometimes not as clear as I can be. And the same thing on Zoom. If you want to pull up the chat, just so that I can see it, if they have a question and they want to write it in the chat, so we can try to address it as we go or at some point in between.
Got it.
Okay. All right, so the first thing I'm going to address with you guys, which is something that maybe has happened to all of you. If you've ever seen a listing agent show up at closing for the seller with a Ring camera, they probably made this mistake before. And so if you look at lines number 18 through 20 of this contract was revised back in 2021. Normally, every 12 to 18 months, you see a new contract come out, which tells you guys this contract has been around for about that amount of time. Any second now, you're probably going to start hearing that we're doing the new as-is contract that's approved by the Florida Bar and the Association of Realtors. But this version here that we're looking at, which is the one we're using now, has a major change in this section, which is line 18 to 20, where now thermostats and doorbells are included with the sale of the property. So if you are a listing agent and you are showing a property or you're taking pictures of a property, it's very important that you have the conversation with your seller as to whether or not they intend for their Ring camera or their Nest thermostat to actually go with the sale of the property. Some people don't, and at the final walkthrough, we see that they are removed and it becomes an issue, and then somebody tries to save the day by buying a new one, whether it be for the buyer or the seller. But to avoid that issue, if you are a listing agent, just ask the question, hey, now the thermostat and the Ring camera supposedly go with the purchase or the sale. Are you willing to let them go? Yes or no? If your seller says that they are not, you can still take pictures or show the property with the Nest or the Ring or whatever devices they have. Just make sure to include them on line 24 and 25 as exclusions of what is not going in the sale of the property. So they can be there, but just make sure that the buyer knows by listing them on line 24 or 25 that the Nest or the Ring or whatever device is not being transferred at the time of the sale. The same way for the buyer. If you are representing a buyer, you take a buyer to see a property and those items are there at the property, you need to make note of it so that you can make sure that they're at closing, because a lot of times when you go to the final walkthrough, you're going to see that they changed it to whatever $29 thermostat they found at Home Depot instead of the $300 list. So that's something to note that I see becomes an issue at the walkthrough specifically for you guys to avoid. The other one is line 31. Line 31 is basically the effective date of the contract, and it specifies that the escrow deposit is due a certain period of time, either with or after the offer is made. What is the effective date on the contract? Does anybody know?
Whenever
When it's been executed.
Yeah. And return. Yeah, return.
When both parties sign.
Right,
When all
so-
parties sign, it's returned. Yeah.
Yes, it needs to have not only execution, but delivery, right? So today, I'm gonna submit an offer. The seller signs the offer. The listing agent doesn't send it back to me. How do I know I'm under contract?
Yeah.
I don't.
I had that issue in an Orlando contract where the buyer's agent didn't, because over there title is different, you know? They never sent it back to me, so I had to call Mark. I wasn't executed.
You had no idea.
No.
So that's exactly what happens. If you are the listing agent and your client actually signs the offer and you have a fully executed contract, your effective date does not count or does not start until the other side knows that your seller executed the contract. So it's not only the day that the last person signed, which is usually what we do. We flip to the back and we're like, what day did they sign? Who was the last person that signed? But you need to always double check that that person actually delivered the signed contract to all parties. So it's rare, but if you get a contract tonight, it's normal. You're doing your thing. You're dealing with kids, houses, whatever. The next morning, you send that contract to everybody and you let them know that you're under contract. You should send in that same email saying the effective date is to confirm that it's not the effective date for the contract. The reason why I always recommend that we do this up front is number one, if there's any dispute as to whether or not that is the effective date, let's clear the air and get it done while everybody is in their happiest mood out of this entire transaction. And number two, because then that sets clear expectations for everybody on the transaction as to what the next steps are and what it is that the deadlines are going to be moving forward. Don't wait until we're wondering whether the inspection period is over or not to dispute when the inspection period ends. Same thing with all of your other contingencies and deadlines on the contract. So it's very important that when you send that first email, and if you guys don't like to do that, just let Heidi know, hey, I want you guys to send out the email with the deadline for me, so that way everybody on the transaction knows and is aware, and if there's any dispute, we get it done right away.
So I'm representing the buyer, I sent in the offer, right, the contract, it gets executed, I get it back. Should the listing agent be typing up okay, we are officially on the contract as of this date? And if they do not, then do I reply with the actual date, just to make sure that
Precisely.
everything is in the.
Right, as a listing agent, when you send out the fully executed contract, best practice is to include your timelines right there, just the most important deadlines. You don't have to put every single deadline on there. But if the listing agent does not, then as a buyer's agent, you should reply and say, received, thank you, here's the timeline, just so that we clear the air at the very beginning of the transaction. That also helps, especially if you all copy your client on the transaction from the beginning. It helps your client know the day the escrow deposit is due, the day the inspection has to be done, and things like that. So it also sets an expectation and a tone for the buyer as well.
Sorry, last question. And as a listing agent, let's say that you send a counter to the buyer's agent, how do you regain the power if they don't reply?
That's literally the next point we're gonna go over. So that takes care of your effective dates. It's the date that everybody receives the executed copy of the contract. Going now to this next point, lines 46 through 47 make it super clear that the time for acceptance of any counter offer is 2 days after the counter offer is delivered. So if I'm a buyer's agent, I submit an offer, the listing agent comes back with counters. In order for me to secure that transaction for my buyer, I need to make sure that within 2 days, I get back to that listing agent. If I don't, technically that listing agent has no responsibility to me and has no reason to accept my offer after those 2 days have elapsed.
Is that calendar or business?
Calendar days.
So Saturday, Sunday.
That's it. Every time, no matter what, you need to have conferred with your client within 48 hours and determine whether we're going to counter back or whether we're going to accept the terms or what it is that we're going to do. Specifically, during the height of this crazy market we had last year, I had clients that were under contract for 2 different buyers because they countered 2 different people at the same time, and they both accepted within the 2-day window. So that's not as common now, but please be aware that is possible. These people had repercussions against their licenses. They're going before the board because that is an ethical violation. So be very careful. Make sure that when you are going to entertain a different offer, that your time for counter offers has elapsed, or that you have written confirmation from the listing agent, from the buyer's agent, that their buyer is not interested in your counter, correct? Because if not, you could put yourself in a situation where you are otherwise under contract with 2 buyers, which sounds crazy, but it's true.
The buyer will be under contract with one house and one house waiting to hear from both of the listing agents.
The listing agent sent 2 counters. So she received 2 offers, or he received offers. They countered both offers at the same time, and both buyers accepted the counters.
Oh, also the listing agent is wrong for doing that.
Correct.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. On the buyer side, you see this happen more often than not. Yeah, it's very right. But a lot of people, what they do is they accept, or they'll accept the counter so that they're under contract, and then they'll keep shopping during their inspection period and get out of your contract and go to another one. That's unfortunately not an ethical violation, but the listing agent having a fully executed contract with 2 buyers is a problem, especially if both buyers actually want the property. Then it turns into a whole mess. Correct.
But I have a question, the 2-day thing, it only pertains like if you do not put a date here? On
No.
line 40.
Even if you, so the date, so the line 45, which is that blank, is how long the seller has to consider and accept your offer. So a lot of times you'll write up an offer today on behalf of your buyer, you'll send it to the listing agent, and you'll say, by Monday, my buyer needs to know if you're going to accept or not. You would put Monday's date on that line. That's when we're submitting the offer. But then when this received our offer and has made edits, sometimes to the escrow deposit, whatever it is, that's considered a counter offer. And so then that counter offer is the one that the buyer legally has 2 days after the day they receive the counter to accept. Okay. Questions on that section? Okay. The next thing that we are going to talk about is the paragraph 5 extension of closing date, specifically lines 58 through 59. This is another thing that causes a lot of problems on transactions with financing, again, in the craziness of the market more than now. But that section years ago, if any of you were in the industry around 2013 or 2014, there was no such thing as a CFPB. There was no such thing as a CD. The only thing that we used was HUDs back then. And so then this huge change came in where we were changing not only the documents that we were using, but the timelines and the different requirements of when they had to be shared in the transaction. Before this change, you could literally give somebody a HUD for the first time when they were sitting on the closing table and nothing will happen. And obviously you guys can understand how that was problematic because some buyers were learning their fees at the closing table when they were about to lose a deposit. No matter what happened, it gave way for lenders to take advantage of people. It gave way for there to be a lot of unpleasant surprises at closing. So that's why the CFPB comes in and says, we're going to start doing this thing called a CD, which they felt was an easier way of understanding closing figures. And they were also going to then require that the buyer knew their figures or had a very good idea of their figures at certain points throughout the transaction. That revolutionized the title industry and the mortgage industry because people weren't used to those deadlines or those requirements, and people were missing deadlines left and right. And since technically that wasn't the buyer's fault, this paragraph was initially added into this contract to protect the buyer if their title company or their lender was not with it and did not know what they had to do. Initially, you could extend your contract for up to 10 days for any reason related to CFPB trade and disclosures. So back in the day, people used to not be ready for clear to close and just be like, well, according to paragraph 5, I have 10 more days, and it would be an automatic extension of your contract. As time has gone on, as we've become more comfortable with the CFPB requirements, as the lenders understand what they have to do, this paragraph has gotten more and more strict. So even most recently in the last version of the contract, one of you guys may have experienced that somebody told you, well, according to paragraph 5, I have 10 more days to figure out what I need to do before I get cleared to close. And it really was a way for someone who was financing to extend the contract, even if the seller didn't agree. This clause gets stricter and stricter every time that this contract gets revised. And they have now lowered it to be 7 days is the maximum that you can extend. But they have also conditioned it on the fact that your loan approval has to have been obtained and the lender's underwriting is complete. So this is no longer now a loophole for you to finish underwriting your mortgage. It's, go ahead.
So it's basically because you don't have the CD.
It's basically because somebody forgot to send out the CD. And we all know that that's very unlikely nowadays, but it can happen. And obviously that's not necessarily the buyer's fault. So if the lender really forgets to send out the CD, and that's really the reason why we can't close, this clause will still protect them. But this is no longer a clause that you can use to say, well, I get an automatic extension on closing because the lender is not ready. The lender has to be ready. And that's something that whoever you guys work with to do your financing, they should be aware of it, but you should always remind them, like, we need to make sure we get the CD out because this is no longer a reason to be able to extend closing. I've had lenders argue with me that they can extend closing 7 days because of this clause. Depending on what side I'm on, I have a creative argument back. But at the end of the day, we need to know what's right and what's wrong and try to do what's right to avoid these sorts of issues throughout the transaction. Another mistake that I see a lot, and this is a really fatal mistake because you can completely kill a transaction based off of this, is not checking off paragraph 6B, which is line 72. If you are selling a property, listing a property on behalf of a seller, and you know there's a tenant in that property, and you do not check off box 6B, you are subjecting your seller to have the transaction canceled at any point all the way up through closing, and to lose the buyer's escrow deposit. Because, or sorry, for the seller not to be entitled for the buyer's escrow deposit. The reason being, if you do not check off box 6B, you are certifying that you are going to give the buyer a vacant property at closing. And if on the day of closing, the fact is that the property is not vacant, the buyer can back out, get their escrow deposit, and the seller lost a whole lot of time. There's a lot of creative reasons why people don't check off box 6B. There's a lot of financing reasons why people don't check off box 6B. Do it at your own risk. But make sure your seller knows that if we are not checking off box 6B and there is a tenant on the property, the buyer can back out and walk away at any point and not lose a dime.
Should there be some sort of finance reason to not check, you know,
Yes,
can you do an addendum that's separate, like the bank wouldn't see that?
could you? Yes. It's a
So, like,
creative.
you know what, I
I'm
don't-
staying there, you just do the full document.
Right, this is not seller, this is third party,
Tenant.
unrelated, right, to the seller.
Okay, yeah.
So what happens there, and again, I'm a lawyer. You're effectively proving that you are doing something you're not supposed to be doing by doing that. You're putting in writing that you know that this contract doesn't say that, and that, So as a realtor who either has to prepare or somehow put your hand in that addendum by giving it to your buyer or seller, I don't recommend it. It's Miami, all sorts of stuff happens. I tell you what you should do, you guys do what you think, but at the end of the day, we have licenses to protect, right? And we try to do things the most correct way as possible, but that's the risk. The risk is that if we don't put that there's a tenant, at some point, we could lose the entire transaction, especially if, you know, we have buyers that are not very decisive, that they want to keep shopping while they're under contract and doing inspections. And so those are the risks that you should make your seller aware of. Again, it's a conversation with the seller. I like to educate my clients. I like to make sure that they understand. I talk to them straight. I tell them how it is, and then they can decide whatever they want because it's their free will, right? But they can't come back and tell me, Claudia, you didn't tell me. I told you. And you decided to go this way. And this happened as a result of that. But then they can't turn around on you and say that you didn't guide them or you misled them or you somehow, you know, wasted their time or whatever the case may be. That's what I care about in these transactions. And I'm sure that's what you guys care about too, is your relationship with the client, right? Miami is crazy. All sorts of stuff happens in Miami that is not normal. And we have to compete with the other people who do those things because if not, we stay behind. I understand. But I still think that you guys should be very upfront with your clients and let them know the, you know, pros and cons of each offer that they receive. And then from there, they can decide whatever they want. So that's one thing that I see a lot on these. And especially now, I had a closing last year that was supposed to happen in October. And there was an Airbnb listing that had the property reserved for the end of the year, for New Year's Eve. Guys, it's important to disclose that. Like, the buyer needs to know that he can't live on his property on New Year's Eve. Like, so this also applies when it's something like that. So if it's a property that's Airbnb or VRBO or short-term rental, that is a tenant. It's a short-term tenant, but it's a tenant nonetheless. So that's something that you guys need to keep in mind, especially now as Airbnbs become more and more popular, that does apply to those types of occupancies as well. Line 82 clarifies what Jen just said. It does not apply to a post occupancy. That's when the seller themselves are staying on the property after closing. There's a different document we fill out for that altogether. Most of the time that we're here today, we're going to be talking about section 8B. It's the financing contingency on your contract. And it's where I get paid the most to do my job, to get people out of the transaction or to make people lose their escrow deposits. There's a lot of technicalities when it comes to this section. It's very easy to understand as long as you know what you're doing and what side you're representing. So hopefully by the time you guys leave here today, you'll have a better understanding of how to use this to your client's advantage, depending on what side you're on. This part of the contract, at one point in time, the last version of this contract used to say that basically at any point throughout the transaction, no matter what your financing contingency was, if the appraisal was received and it was too low to justify the purchase price on the contract, the buyer could back out and could get a refund of their escrow deposit. Specifically in FHA transactions, I would see lenders wait 30, 45, sometimes 60 days to order the appraisal after they knew that they could actually get the loan approved. And then on day 60, come back and say, hey, look, the appraisal was low, we're getting out. And obviously that was super disrespectful to the seller because you've been waiting all this time to try to sell your property just to find out that one of the most important things hadn't been done at the beginning, right? In my opinion, on the transactions where that happened, I think that the listing agents dropped the ball a little bit because you kind of need to follow up on those things to make sure you didn't wait 60 days to ask for the appraisal. But the Association of Realtors and the Florida Bar realized that that clause was a little disrespectful and they got rid of it. So now this clause, what it says is that when you have a financing contingency, at the end of that financing contingency, you have to have an appraisal or valuation of the property that is sufficient to meet the terms of the mortgage altogether. So what does that mean? First off, I tell all of my realtors that the most important date on this contract, if you have a financed transaction, is not your closing date. It is the day that your loan approval expires. The reason being is if we don't make it past that day, we're not going to make it to closing anyway. And that is the day where allegedly or possibly you're putting your buyer's escrow deposit at risk. On the seller side, this day is equally important because that's the day where you're guaranteeing the escrow deposit for your client, no matter whether the buyers can make it to the closing table or not. So I tell everybody that is the most important day. You have to have it on an electronic calendar. You have to put it on your agenda. You have to put a reminder on your phone, but make sure that no matter what, you do not miss this deadline. A lot of times when realtors miss this deadline, they call me and they're like, Claudia, what can I do? I'm like, absolutely nothing. It is what we call a bright line rule in the law, which means you miss the day, there's no going back. Exactly. So Very important. Independent of that, what happens on day 30, day 45, or whatever it is? For my purposes today, I'm going to talk about day 30. Day 30 is our financing contingency. On day 30, your buyer basically needs to either confirm to the listing agent that they are going to proceed with the transaction and risk their escrow deposit no matter what, or ask for more time because they didn't get approved by the bank. Generally, other than those two things, there's not much else that you should do on day 30, unless it's, I know for a fact this guy's not going to get approved and we're just releasing and canceling the contract. But within those 30 days, you guys have to have a very good relationship with your lender. And your lender have to be aware of that deadline and also know what is pending coming up and leading up to that deadline, right? So I know you guys are not mortgage lenders, but at the end of the day, I say that you guys are the heart of the transaction. Why? Because you guys find the client. A lot of the times you guys have a group of lenders or different lenders that you recommend to the client. And if one of your lenders messes up the transaction, they're messing it up for you that got the client, that is the one that gives them the face, that talks to the client 100 times a day, right? So at the end of the day, you guys have to know who you work with and work as a team and make sure that you guys are all on the same page. But you guys also have to make sure that the people that you refer are doing their jobs so that you don't end up with egg on your face because you're the one that told your buyer, your listing agent, or whatever, to go with whatever provider. So always make sure that your lenders are up to date on these contracts and on the deadlines. So I still have people that argue with me that this contract says that if the appraisal comes in low, even after the 30 days, that the buyer can get their escrow deposit back. And I'm like, beautiful, point out the line. Tell me what line it is. It doesn't exist. It's not in there anymore. And so then as a buyer's agent, you guys want to make sure that the appraisal gets ordered. Follow up on that. Put it somewhere in your reminders, maybe not on day 2 or day 5 or day 10, but maybe like day 15 or day 20. We should have an appraiser out to the property. And if you guys don't hear about an appraiser, you guys should be following up about it. The same way on the listing side, like I was just explaining, nobody wants to waste their time with their property on the market for 30 days and not make it to closing and have to list it again and have to do another open house or whatever it is that you have to do to get your buyers nowadays, right? So you guys should also be following up on the listing agent side to make sure these appraisals are ordered and that the reports are coming in or when they're expected, if it came in at value or not. Because if not, you guys are wasting time that you could be moving on to another buyer or doing whatever it is that you want to do with the property. So make sure that within those 30 days, that there is a conditional approval that the lender is going to issue. That conditional approval is not a loan approval. They're two completely different things. I have realtors who have shared conditional approvals with the listing agent and have said, we have received loan approval, see attached. Do you know what you just did? The day that you share your loan approval, you're ending your financing contingency. So as of that day that you share your loan approval, you're basically saying my buyer's making it to closing no matter what, or if not, you can keep their escrow deposit. There is no reason why in the first place, you as a realtor should be sharing a conditional approval. If anybody on the transaction is sharing a conditional approval, it should be your lender. It shouldn't be you. You don't have a loan license, you don't do loans, you should not be sharing conditional approvals. Number 2, sharing conditional approvals is illegal, but that's a whole different story. Again, Miami, things happen, DUs, all these other things that people request, but you're not a lender, you're a realtor. You should stick to what the realtor has to do on the transaction. So always, if that is going to be shared, that should be shared by the lender on the transaction, only with the buyer's permission. And after that, they should specify that it is a conditional approval that they are working on to get to the final loan approval. I've had people share that conditional approval and say, my client's getting approved for the loan on day 5. And as of day 5, you better hope and pray and light all your little candles that you're actually going to make it to day 30, because if you don't make it to day 30, you're going to have a pretty upset buyer on your hands. So always leave those things up to the lender, but make sure you get a conditional loan approval. Make sure that your lender is in contact with your buyer about the conditional loan approval. So what are the conditions that came up on this approval? And make sure that there's a clear line of communication with your buyer as to, can we clear these conditions? A lot of the times, I mean, you guys have probably seen a conditional approval before. It sometimes asks for explanations as to certain amounts of monies that came in and out of accounts. Sometimes it asks for a more recent pay stub or something that will support the money that's coming into these accounts. But sometimes the conditional loan approval, especially if it's somebody that's self-employed, asks for a profit and loss that confirms $500,000 in income per year. And sometimes that ain't that easy to get. So you guys need to make sure that you're aware of what your conditions are and how realistic it is that you're actually going to be able to clear them. Because if not, you could put yourself in a situation where you're going to risk your buyer's deposit and there's no going back after that. Day 30 comes around. We've done everything we should in order to get our loan approved. We just don't have loan approval. Sometimes there's minor conditions that are pending. Sometimes it's the profit and loss showing a $500,000 profit a year. We need to be able to get on the phone with our lender within a day or two of notice. If your lender doesn't answer the phone for you ever, that's a red flag. Everybody's busy, everybody has things, but everybody should be getting back to you in 24 to 48 hours. So if your loan approval period is 30 days, on day 28, you need to be on the phone with your lender and say, what's pending to get clear to close? What conditions are pending in order for me to be able to resubmit the loan for clear to close? If your lender tells you, hey, look, Claudia, all we need is a pay stub. And I think that as long as we have a pay stub, next week we'll be clear to close. That's the only pending condition. Beautiful. Or if I need a copy of your ID or your social security card or whatever, we know that those conditions are not necessarily conditions that are going to prevent us from closing. But again, if the condition is, prove that you made $500,000 last year and you're pretty sure this guy did not make $500,000 last year, the conversation that you're going to have subsequent to that with your buyer is going to change substantially. So
how long would that we needed the transcript from the IRS for self-employed, and they actually mailed them out. So whatever the IRS had on file was now what the lender needed. And we actually had to have the buyer resubmit electronically in order to get that through. But the condition was that there was no way we were ever, and the IRS is not gonna help you. So there was no way we were gonna ever get that.
have you guys ever tried calling the IRS? Good luck. So those are the kind of things. And again, you guys are not lenders. You don't have to be lenders. That's not what I'm telling you to do. I'm telling you to know how to do the follow-up to make sure that the lender side is moving accordingly. And so that you guys can work together, because again, you guys are the point of contact with the client a lot of times. And a lot of times it is easier for you to reach out to the client about certain things than it is to wait for the lender to do it or whatever the case may be. But just be on top of it. That's the bottom line. And make sure that you are realistic about whether or not you can get those things done in that time frame. Here's why. Because when the buyer is in a situation where they're possibly going to lose their escrow deposit, they're going to be looking at you. And it was your job to be able to get an extension on that loan, the loan approval period. It was your job to do a release and cancellation of the contracts. It's not the lender's job to do it. So I've had situations where unfortunately the lender and the realtor start pointing fingers at each other as to who didn't do their job. Getting the extension for your loan approval period is a realtor's task. So you need to know, and your lender needs to tell you if you need to do that. Obviously, if your lender doesn't tell you that, then you don't know, but you should be on the phone with your lender and you should know regardless of your lender reaching out to you or not. Day 28 comes around. We have a problem with an IRS transcript that we don't know if we're going to be able to get, that we're not sure if it's going to be able to get cleared in time for closing. What do? You have to do one thing, put it in writing. A lot of times as realtors and as attorneys and title companies, we like to have phone calls and we like to just get it done because it's quicker. But when something happens, how do we prove what happened? We don't. And so then that's the number one lesson you guys are going to learn in today's class. When you speak to your buyer, when you speak to your seller, when you speak to whoever, send them a quick one-line email. Email, not text message, and we'll get to that at the end of the class as well. Send an email. Per our conversation, the inspection is taking place tomorrow. Per our conversation, the appraisal is taking place tomorrow. Per our conversation, whatever. But make sure that you send those emails, because if you end up in a situation where you have a problem on that file and we need to prove that you did certain things and all you have is a call log, it's not going to be very easy. And obviously at that time, nobody's going to say, yeah, she called me and she asked me for a 5-day extension and I did nothing. No, they're gonna be like, I never got that phone call. That phone number, I've never even heard of it. Never called it before. So make sure you guys protect yourselves by doing that. Day 28 comes around, we have an issue. We don't have loan approval. We don't know if we will have loan approval by day 30. As a buyer's agent, you need to send out an email, and that email is going to have 2 things attached to it. Number 1, it's going to have an extension of your loan approval period for X number of days. Go ahead.
Questions? Question is that if they don't reply within the acceptance date, the buyer is not attached to the contract anymore?
Correct.
And who keeps the deposit if the deal falls through?
It depends. So it all depends who breached. Why did the deal fall through? If the deal falls through because, for example, the buyer didn't get approved for financing, then possibly the seller. If the deal falls through because the seller decided that they didn't want to sell and the buyer was having a really good day and decided to release them, it all depends what the release and cancellation says. So a lot of times the release and cancellation is going to say who gets what. Well, both sides have to sign it. So both sides have to have agreed to do the release and cancellation. Sometimes we do a release and cancellation based off what the contract says or what the law says. And sometimes we just do a release and cancellation because we'd rather move on with our lives and not deal with the problem instead of actually pursuing what's legal, right? I've had sellers that have released contracts for buyers where buyers were supposed to lose their escrow deposit and they just didn't care because they wanted to relist the property. Not having a release and cancellation ties you up from relisting the property. And so then a lot of people, sometimes they're like, I don't even care about the escrow deposit. I just want to get rid of this buyer so I can move on to another buyer. And the same way I have buyers who, you know, were probably not entitled to their escrow deposit, but they've gotten it back. It's very hard to say in an open-ended question like that because little details can really affect the outcome of what happens. That's why if you guys are ever in a situation where you have a buyer or a seller who's trying to go after an escrow deposit, I always tell you guys to call me. I do a free 10-minute consultation, no obligation to anybody, but kind of to run through the facts because little details could really affect whether or not one side or the other side is entitled to a deposit. In the case that we just talked about where there's a tenant and there's no mention of a tenant on the contract, at any point throughout the transaction, the buyer can get out and get their escrow deposit back because the contract doesn't say that there's a tenant. I've had people be like, they did an inspection and they saw the tenant at the inspection. Yeah, but according to the contract, the tenant was gonna be out by the day of closing. So it really depends. There's a lot of different things that could change that, but obviously if the buyer breaches, generally the buyer is not the one that gets to keep the deposit. And if the seller breaches, then the seller is generally not the one that gets to keep the deposit. Going back to what we were talking about then about the 28 days, you guys are going to send an email as a buyer's agent if you don't have loan approval. And your email is going to say two things. The first one is going to be an extension of the loan approval period for X amount of days. Again, this is where your communication with your lender is super important. You need to know what the pending conditions are and what your lender thinks it's going to take to clear those conditions. And then also have a conversation with your buyer as to how quickly can you get me this documentation, the profit and loss? How can you resubmit the transcripts? Whatever the issue is, have a realistic timeline and then always add 2 days is what I say. Because you don't want to put yourself where 3 days later, you're asking for another extension with the same excuse. So give yourself a little bit of time. And then the other thing is you always have to attach a release and cancellation. If you do not attach the release and cancellation, you are risking your buyer's escrow deposits. So your email to the listing agent should be, our financing deadline is currently, or our loan contingency expires on, I don't know, April 1st. We are working diligently to get clear to close, but we have a few conditions pending. As a result, we're requesting a 5-day extension on the loan approval, and attached is an extension for your client to sign. In the alternative, if your client is not willing to give us a 5-day extension, then my client has no choice but to release and cancel the contract. And I've also attached the release and cancellation here for your use. The reason being is they're either going to A, give you the extension, or B, you protected your client's escrow deposit. And then a lot of times sending that email where now it's like, well, you give me the extension or I cancel. A lot of people are gonna give you the extension, guys, because 5 more days is not a big deal. They might call you, they might want a little bit more information as to what's pending and how realistic it is that it's gonna get resolved. But be candid, be honest. It's a lot better to be honest and have good communication with the other side than it is to lie to them every 5 days and say there's only one condition, because at some point they're gonna be like, I was dealing with one condition 4 weeks ago and you're still telling me about the same condition. So that's something that's now incorporated into line 106 of that last paragraph on page 2. And this is something that Jen and I had to use on a lender recently. He was not from South Florida and it was clear, but he basically told us he couldn't give us any information, but like radio silence. We were like emailing ourselves back and forth in the whole chain. It was just us, our side emailing, hey, following up, hey, following up, hey. They wouldn't even say like, I received your email, or like, let me work on it, or I'll get back to you, nothing. It was like we were talking to a wall. And then he basically replied to us saying like, I can't give you any information whatsoever after this transaction. We were on the seller side. He was clearly on the buyer side. Lines 106 through 110 now talk about the fact that in signing this contract, the buyer now has to keep the seller informed about the status of the mortgage loan application. And by signing it specifically, it says here on line 108, the buyer authorizes the broker, lender, closing agent to discuss the status of your loan transaction. Again, I don't care where the guy works. I don't care what he makes an hour, and I don't care what his taxes were for last year, but I need to know that the loan was submitted, that we got a conditional approval, that we're working through conditions, something so that I know the loan is moving forward and that I'm not just waiting till the loan approval period expires to get a release and cancellation, right? Or so that I have an idea, like, do I have to start, thinking about how I'm gonna market this property again if this deal falls through? So if you guys have buyers that you're working with, let them know. Again, personal details are not going to be, exchanged, and no one's gonna be telling anybody all your personal information, but we need to let the sellers know that we're moving and we're doing what we're supposed to be doing during these 30 days. It's not just radio silence.
Is there no, go ahead.
Isn't there a spot in this area where it says that your buyer with their application to the lender within a certain time period?
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes, that's at the very beginning. You're gonna see here on line 97. Normally people leave it blank, and so it's 5 days.
Okay.
And you can ask for confirmation that the application was submitted. A lot of the times, people, especially if they're serious about buying, they've already submitted an application. They're just pending the property information at the time that they get under contract. But yeah, that's another follow-up that you can do within 5 days to make sure that the actual application has been submitted.
In a sense of the status updates, is there like a set amount of, like, I don't know, like keywords I'm looking for? Like I know that they can not give you too much personal information, but is there like a set of things we're looking for in a specific thing? Like,
I mean, basically this, has the application been submitted? Have you received all the documents that, you need supporting documentation to submit? Have you received the conditional approval? Are you working through the conditional approval? Sometimes you can ask like, hey, are the conditions, generally okay? Are they crazy? Is there anything, they're never gonna, or they don't have to tell you. I've had people come back with a list of conditions, literally telling us, copying and pasting the conditions. It all depends, right? But at the end of the day, if they want to get testy with you, they don't have to tell you exactly what the conditions are. They just have to tell you that there's conditions. And then, you can say like, are there 5 or more? Is there 15 conditions? Obviously, if you guys have worked on both sides of the transaction, you have an idea that most loans come back with conditions. It's not a red flag that the loan is going to come back with conditions. But at the end of the day, you want to know, like, are you working through the conditions? Is the buyer cooperating to provide what you need? Those are the kind of things that I would ask. And then
Provide this, they don't know.
they do not.
Can you add to the contract, like buyer agrees to provide seller conditional approval?
It's a RESPA violation, really, is what it is.
You're not
Yeah,
allowed.
you're not allowed.
Like,
Not even
yeah.
like your DU or requested to it, like here's.
I know, no, I'm to Miami, like
Yeah.
literally. I love Miami. Sorry. You shouldn't, and that's why I always tell my realtors, you're not the lender, so why are you dealing with the DU?
Right.
And the lenders, I always tell them, share it, get an email from the buyer saying that you have authorization.
So when the listing agent on the listing on the MLS, they put send you.
That's a RESPA violation, yeah.
I've said that they don't care.
No, people don't care, the same way that you must use XYZ title company, that's a RESPA violation, people don't care, like,
Really?
yeah. So it's Miami, people get away with murder, it is what it is, like you have to learn how to play in the playground, right? You can't be the only one that follows all the rules because, you're never gonna freaking close a file, but do it within the parameters of what you know is the best way to do it. Like I said, if you're gonna share something that you're not supposed to share, get something in writing from your client that they authorize you to share it, you can educate your client, hey, look, this is the listing. The listing says that they want us to share the DU. Your DU has personal information. It's not legally required that you share it, but if we don't share it, they won't take us seriously. So I recommend that you share it, give me authorization so that I can share it. Okay, done. You know what I'm saying? Or a lot of times what I tell my realtor is submit your offer, CC your lender, and say the lender is attached here too and can provide additional information as to the buyer's qualifications. And then the lender can be the one to reply and be like, here's the DU, the pre-approval, whatever it is that they're asking
And
for.
that's what I was gonna ask you, like something to reply to kind of relieve our liability on our part and put it on the lender if they do want to share that.
Exactly, and the lender again can share it as long as the buyer has agreed for the lender to share it. So it's not that we can't do what everybody does, it's just that we're gonna do it a different way so that we're a little bit more protected if anything does come up. Questions and comments so far?
When you dealt with the one where they weren't communicating with you?
Yes.
It was the old one or was this new one?
This one.
Oh, it's new. So
Yeah.
you could just tell me.
We literally wrote according to lines, but he wasn't from South Florida. And he even replied to us like, I don't understand why your sellers wants to get in a mark out of this contract in such a terrible seller's market. I'm like,
Yeah, you too.
did you look at where this contract is located? We're like insular. We're not going through what everybody else is going through right now as far as, I mean, I'm not telling you it's the hottest market we've ever seen, but It's not the market that he was seeing in like Milwaukee or wherever the hell he was from, so like completely different. Yeah, it was obnoxious. Yeah, so that's basically it. It's common courtesy. It's keeping everybody informed, you know, even if he would have replied and said, look, I can't provide that information, but it's moving along the way it's supposed to, something, but he was just ignoring us, so then we ganged up on him and.
I have a question. Aisha, you have a question?
Sorry, yes, I have a question. What if, okay, say for instance, they do back out or or breach the contract, do the realtors get paid or it just goes to?
Depending on who backs out, the answer to your question changes. On their listing agreement, it should say that if the buyer breaches and the seller keeps a portion of the buyer's escrow deposit, that the listing broker gets paid a portion of the escrow deposit that the seller gets. So if you were saying they for the seller, then that's the answer. On the buyer's
Okay.
side, no, the realtor doesn't get paid if the buyer doesn't make it to closing because you brought a buyer that was supposed to make it to closing, so you didn't. However, when you sign the release and cancellation, I've seen people put a brokerage on the release and cancellation. That money is going to a brokerage. And so if there's, I don't know, sometimes you guys have certain expenses that you undertake in order to get the property looking a certain way or whatever it is that you have marketing fees. I've seen that the release and cancellation will have like, you know, $100 to the seller, $100 to the buyer, and $100 to each of the brokers or something like that. So you can negotiate anything in a release and cancellation, but generally, if you didn't bring a ready, willing, and able buyer, you're not getting paid.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sorry if I'm wrong. If you're representing a seller that you gave, because me and him have a situation, she wants to cancel her contract.
Her listing agreement
Her listing agreement
with you guys.
But no, not.
Oh, with somebody else. Okay.
He's trying to give $10,000.
What does it say on the listing agreement? Have you seen it?
She hasn't shown it, maybe she's like, I
And
think.
he paid, and I'm looking at 1% for
For a whole year.
90%, 79, yeah.
So most of these listing agreements you can get out of at any time. And the ones that I've seen that have like the craziest terms is like you have to pay the realtor whatever they spent to market. But how could he justify a $10,000 marketing fee? Like, what did he do? And why is that property not sold 3 years ago? If you spend $10,000 on marketing the property, I mean, he must have like redone the property or something, no? And
He doesn't even know it. He doesn't even.
you have to be careful because sometimes you don't know if the seller is like messing with you or like just not committed to actually cancel. But most of those agreements, if they haven't found a buyer, you can cancel as long as you pay them a cancellation fee. But it literally says 10 grand on there. That's obnoxious. If I were her, I would report him. That's your commission.
I don't understand how he hasn't been reported. He's super like,
Yeah.
shame.
No, that's obnoxious. Guys, Miami is this
Well,
big.
why would you
like-
sign that? I think that because he dominates the area, he doesn't on his EDM, and he goes off.
So like, that's what she told me. I was like, why would you sign that? And she had told you dominant.
That's wild. Yeah, no, I've never seen one that actually says 10,000.
I know an attorney that can get it out of them.
I don't know, man, if she signed it. That's the other thing, and like, people always tell me like, oh, I signed it because I didn't know. Like, guys, unfortunately, not knowing is not an excuse. Like, you call me and you want me to review your contract, I don't charge you anything. How long can it possibly take me? Like, I'd rather that you guys know what your client is signing, that if your client has any questions, that they know what they're signing. But at the end of the day, like, after you put your signature on it, it's really hard for me to argue that you didn't know what you're signing, because your opportunity to ask questions was right then. You know, something that happened last year is, well, it happened the year before, but people started finding out about it after. There's a company that was going around during COVID and sending a letter to homeowners that because of COVID relief, every homeowner was getting $1,000 for free to help them cover costs. And there's a specific area in Kendall where like these people went ham, and what they would do is they would give you $1,000 in exchange for a perpetual exclusive listing agreement for your property. And it's like against heirs, assigned, blah, 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 and they were recorded against the property. And when I went to do the first one, this is how I first found out about it. I went to do a sale, and when I pulled title, I'm like, ¿qué es esto? I was like, this has to be illegal. Apparently it's not. but it was predatory AF, the same as what you're saying, little viejitos who actually had no freaking money, who needed help, who got $1,000, and in exchange for the $1,000, if they ever sold their property, the broker was entitled to the 3%, regardless of whether they were the ones that sold it or not. I'm like, bro, karma is gonna get you so bad, like, for $1,000. I'm like, imagine if you can guarantee to sell a whole block for $1,000 each property, like, you would get rich. You would get rich off of this property. So tell your clients, like, please.
You have a copy of that contract?
Call the Republic Records.
I got $5,000.
Bulletin about it, and they were like, it's
I'm gonna
legal.
buy lists.
It's legal, it's notarized and everything. I'm like, that's insane. So good for your pocket, bad for business, but at the end of the day, people have to be careful.
My karma's gonna hit me in Punta Cana.
You're gonna be too drunk to notice, it doesn't matter. So those are the things you always have to tell your clients, you know, like, please call us. You guys know what listing agreements look like, you know, like, you guys know what a lot of those documents look like. An opinion, if you have somebody that knows that, you know, wants to know before they sign something, you can save them from those crazy ass situations that we see only in Miami.
Only in Dade. Only in Dade.
The other thing is, a lot of times, or it says here that you're supposed to, but lines 111 to 113, if the buyer obtains loan approval before the end of the loan approval period, you're supposed to share your loan approval. So again, remember.
Who would say that?
I can tell you not to, but remember, you don't want to share that too early, because at the end of the day, I mean, people break their legs and lose their jobs, guys. It's the reality of life. So make sure that if you're exchanging a loan approval, don't do it like 30 or 40 days before closing, because a lot can happen in 30 days. If you're only a few days out from closing, then that's fine. The same way, going back to what we were talking about, loan approval, day 28, how you check in and make sure that everything's moving the way that it's supposed to. Before you send that email to the listing agent, you should also send an email to your client. Hey, per our conversations, we don't have final loan approval. As a result, we agreed that we are going to ask for the extension or otherwise release and cancel, because if not, you're retaining your escrow deposit. And the line that I love to put in my emails when I'm in a hurry and I don't have time for people to like not reply, because people like to read emails and just be like, okay, but not tell me okay, is if this is not your understanding, please contact me ASAP. And if you saw the email,
If you disagree, contact me.
if you didn't do anything when you saw my email, then I don't need to follow up to see why you didn't reply, blah, blah, blah. You would have called me, right? And if you didn't call me that day or the next day or the day after, then you can't say like, oh, well, the email said to contact me if that was not the understanding. So if you're ever in a hurry or your client is not good with responding to your emails, I have clients that I call and they're like, oh yeah, I saw it, I'm okay with it. I'm like, were you gonna tell me or was I gonna know through osmosis? So I put those lines in there and I'm like, that's okay, don't worry, don't reply. If there's any issues, please contact me ASAP, or if this was not your understanding, please contact me ASAP. And that way I covered myself, but I don't have to sit there and follow up with the client 100 times to give me a response. The same way, if for any reason you get on the phone with your lender and your lender's like, look, Claudia, I just need one more pay stub, like there's not gonna be an issue here, we're gonna get the clear to close. I still write a CYA to the client as the realtor. Hey, according to our conversation with the lender, there is an outstanding condition before we can get clear to close. We need your paycheck that you get on Friday or a copy of your pay stub that you get on Friday. But we've confirmed that we're not going to ask for an extension on the loan approval. And that as of today, if for any reason you don't make it to closing, you will be risking your escrow deposit. Again, if this is not your understanding, please call me ASAP so that way, when you don't ask for the extension and something happens with that pay stub or whatever the case may be, it doesn't fall on you that you didn't do your job or that you weren't requesting whatever extension you weren't supposed to request in the first place. Okay. The other thing that they clarified on this contract is on lines 120 through 122. And last year, guys, I kid you not, I probably made 20% of my revenue in my law firm from writing the same letter over and over and over and over again. So last year, when the market was crazy and your property was worth an extra $30,000 in 30 days, people were dying to get rid of their buyers because they just wanted to find another buyer who was going to pay more for the same exact property. If you are the buyer's agent, day 30 comes and you do nothing, you're risking that the seller cancels your buyer's contract. You have to send an email on day 30. That email can be, we're good, see you at the closing table. The email can be, I need a little bit more time, or here's the release. But the email cannot be silenced, because if you don't affirmatively states something about that loan approval period, the seller can cancel your contract. And so then you don't want your buyer looking at you on day 31 saying, I paid for inspection, appraisal, whatever, and the contract got canceled on me. Why? Why? Because you didn't send an email. So day 30 should be on your calendars, even if you have your loan approval, even if you're gonna be clear to close, even if you have the cleanest lender file in the history of the world, you should always be sending an email on day 30.
And when you say day 30, you mean your loan commitment date?
Correct.
So you can put 21 days
Yeah,
or what?
Exactly.
So that day,
But that's-
regardless, you have to send an email
Yeah.
to.
Unless you sent it earlier for some reason, but yes, that day you have to send an email confirming that buyer is proceeding, buyer has loan approval, whatever you want to say, but you have to send an email, because if not, then the seller, again, in maybe a more favorable market, but I've seen it happen for a number of reasons. People change their minds about selling and they're dying for the buyer to default so that they can cancel the contract and not sell anymore. So if that does happen, they do have to return the escrow deposit. So the buyer gets the escrow deposit back, but the seller is released from any liability under the contract.
Even if the lender sent out the clear to close to everybody, to all parties?
Something has to have been sent. So if something was sent, then you're good. But you can't just be like, oh yeah, we're good, lender, don't worry, nothing to do, and you don't send any approval. A lot of times, you guys know, it probably happened to one of you, that the seller wants to back out for no damn reason. And then when the seller wants to back out and they talk to an attorney, the attorney is like, one of the few ways that you can get out of this contract is if on day 30, you don't get an email. Dude, those sellers wait up till 12:01 that day on 30th day, and they're just waiting for that email not to come in and be like, hey, by the way, you didn't give us notice, so we're canceling. The other reason why I tell you guys to send the timelines early on is the same reason, because the timelines, I've had people miscount days
Yeah, man.
and they send the email on day 31. Too late. So if you sent that email from the beginning and everybody agreed and confirmed and whatever, you save yourself from that situation. But I've had people send the email on day 31 and not realize it. When it comes to your loan approval, guys, I don't care if it's a Saturday, a holiday, Christmas, Thanksgiving, New Year's, whatever day it is, make sure you send that email. Don't try to argue something creative later on for the reason why you didn't send that email. Wake up at 7 a.m., do it and get it done. But don't leave that to arguing about calendar days or business days or whether it was a court holiday or not. I'm gonna give you guys an example of something that happened to me recently. I was representing a seller on a transaction and the buyer has $72,000 in escrow.
Dang.
Another story for another day. I had a guy call me last night who I argued against in another transaction and got the escrow deposit back. And so last night he was like, hey, I need you on my side now. I was like, $150,000 in escrow. Why do you guys do that?
No, we don't allow.
Oh, that market is not here anymore. Like, what are you guys doing? So he lost, or he was about to lose $150,000 for his client. This other agent, insane, guys, 10, 15, 20, even a crazy property, 50. But like, yeah, those escrow deposits are not necessary. It's like Jenna's saying, you're risking a liability for no damn reason because they're gonna accept your contract with less than that too, right? So it was a cash deal, $72,000 in escrow. It was a $720,000 purchase, so they put 10% in escrow. I'm representing the seller who, the agent that brought me the seller basically has never done a regular purchase or sale in her life. She's only ever done pre-construction, so she has no idea what she's doing. But that's why she comes to me, because I'll guide her or whatever. It was Christmas break. I'm never gonna forget the day that I went to the office that I was like, damn it, why did I post it on here? Because everybody was blowing me up. She calls me. It was December 27th. And she calls me and she's like, hey, Claudia, I'm calling you because that deal that we're working on for the client, they sent me a release and cancellation because the appraisal didn't come back. And the appraisal came back too low. The appraisal came back $65,000 less than the actual contract price. And so they want to renegotiate. My client isn't willing to renegotiate. So I'm just going to sign the release and cancellation. And I was like, I'm out. What do you mean you're going to sign the release and cancellation? When did we go under contract? I know I've been working on that property for a while. She's like, oh, such and such date. Hold on my calendar like a preschooler. 1, 2, 3, 4. The last day that they had to tell them that they wanted to cancel the contract was December 26th. And that was only because the actual deadline was December 25th, which was Christmas. December 26th, I don't even know if the banks were open or not, but everybody was off because Sunday was Christmas. Perfect, I'm gonna give you your holidays, don't worry. So the 26th then was your deadline, no matter what. They reached out to her on the 27th. And on the 27th, they're like, the appraisal came back $65,000 short. Here's your release and cancellation. And I said, okay, perfect. Change your release and cancellation, put the $72,000 to the seller, send it right back and see if they sign it. Do you think they signed it? No, they didn't. And so then she guaranteed for her clients $65,000 above appraised value because a lender and a buyer's agent dropped the ball.
Tremendo Instagram post.
55K over appraisal.
Yeah. And so then that was a situation in which if the seller doesn't know how to use his contract, the listing agent doesn't know how to use a contract, she's gonna kill her client.
You have a, if you can explain a special assessment, A/B.
Yes, I will. Let me finish this concept and then I'll go to that one. If you don't know how to use your contract, guys, you're not doing your client a good service. At the end of the day, do you know how many referrals this lady's gonna get because she got her client? And look, that's like a shot in the dark. That's never gonna happen again, right? But think about it, your marketing, what you're gonna put up, highest sale in the building this year, like all the craziness, right? That's gonna come out of that. And they were gonna do a release and cancellation because she didn't know that the 30 days had passed. She didn't know how to count the 30 days and she didn't know that her client was entitled to keep it. So can you imagine? The buyer's agent, of course, as the buyer's agent, I don't blame them. They had no choice. Like they even tried to give us, and this goes back to that bright line rule I was telling you guys. They even gave us a denial letter that was dated the 24th. And I'm like, beautiful. Did you send it to me? As far as I know, it didn't exist. Plus, how I can backdate anything to January 1st of 1999. That doesn't mean that you gave it to me and that I knew that it was, you know. So learn how to use the contract, guys. Learn how to use the contract, not only how to fit it out, which is very important, but learn how to use it to represent your client. At the end of the day, those are the things that your client is gonna be like, holy shit, Jen is the best realtor on the face of the planet, and everybody they freaking know, they're gonna refer to you, right? That's why we do what we do. A lot of our business comes from repeat business from referral or people that close with us. So it's important that you're paying attention, right? A lot of times we do this all day, and so it gets really mechanical for us. And you're like, oh, whatever, release and cancellation, sign it. Yeah, whatever. Take the extra 5 minutes, count the days, and then go back and tell them. And don't be shy. Be like, you're wrong. Your deadline was yesterday, and the contract says this. And so they're closing. They're closing actually because instead of losing $65,000, they were gonna lose 72. So they're like, whatever. If I'm gonna lose the money anyway, I might as well have an apartment to freaking say something. Yes. The financing contingency. So it can't, and that's the other fault that was the lender's fault there, in my opinion.
Yeah, they ordered it too late.
They know that the holidays are coming up, oh no, because the guy was on vacation. Well, that's your freaking problem. I don't know what to tell you. You needed to make sure. Exactly. And so what I think what ended up happening there is that the realtor dropped the ball. I'm sorry, the lender dropped the ball. They ordered the appraisal too late. The realtor didn't really know or wasn't really prepared to deal with the situation or forgot to follow up on day 30 or day 28. Like I tell you guys, give yourself a little bit of wiggle room. But a bunch of people dropped the ball, and at the end of the day, you should hear the WhatsApp messages. The realtor's like, my client's gonna kill me, blah. I'm like, bro, you didn't do your job. I don't know what to tell you. He's obviously making no commission on his side now because of what happened, but those are expensive lessons that at the end of the day, I promise you the guy is never gonna forget day 30 on one of his contracts or whatever your freaking financing contingency is.
So the listing agent is the one that dropped the ball.
So no, they fired it.
So the buyer's agent.
Yeah.
Sending the cancellation,
They should have sent an extension because he knew he didn't have the appraisal back and not tell me or not tell us and just be like.
The lender didn't communicate, oh, we're ordering it later, like.
But that's the thing. So then you as a realtor, you have a great lender and you love your lender, but we all have a lot of stuff going on. And at the end of the day, we need to stay on top of the files to make sure that things are getting done.
somebody asked if there was no, what you call it, a contingency, but it doesn't matter if you still didn't send it at
Correct,
the time.
exactly. So your contingency ends on the day you put on the contract. So the contingency ended and that's it. They had no way of getting that money back. Going back
They
to
lost the 60 something.
$72,000 in escrow, they had two choices. Keep going with the contract and actually buy the apartment or lose $72,000 and have nothing to show for it. So they kept going.
So
That's all right. I want to pay 72 over.
So if
Yes, if you want to lose the value.
they kept going, they ended up keep going or they were gonna lose money, but they kept going, so buyer ended up paying over.
$65,000 over.
The
appraised
price value.
So it's good for the seller, the seller.
Yeah, the sellers. Happy to pay shit. He loves me.
Or maybe like 5 more, 10 more years to appraise. We'll get to it.
Yeah, you just have to hold it for a
20
really
20 years, will be fine.
Exactly. That's okay. Okay, the other thing that somebody was asking about were special assessments, and that is on, exactly, on line 188. So a lot of times people get so confused in this section, and I've had other title companies argue with me that the special assessments here on this contract are special assessments for an association. They are not. Think about it, guys. Whenever you have a condo or an HOA, there's a separate document that you have to add to this contract to incorporate the things that you need for a condo or an HOA. So why do you think that this contract, which is for a single family home, talks about special assessments? It doesn't. So this special assessment is a special assessment, like if you guys live in an area where they just made like an extra lane on the road closest to your house, they do special assessments for that. If they just put lights on the side of the road, if they built a sidewalk, if they built a little park close to where you live, those are things that come up as special assessments. But in most of the state of Florida, we pay for those special assessments with our taxes. And so then there's no separate bill that needs to get paid. And as you guys know, we already prorate taxes at closing. So if you were a buyer and you bought on February 2nd, you're going to pay for taxes after February 2nd, and the seller pays for the taxes up to February 2nd. So effectively, by prorating the taxes, we're already taking care of the special assessment. So it doesn't matter what you put here, it's not a big deal. At the end of the day, it's going to get prorated with the taxes either way. But a lot of people, and I love this about my agents, they do that sometimes too, they don't know, so they just don't put anything. And I'm like, that's not how that works. But now the Association of Realtors has literally had that happen here so many times that look at line 199. If people don't check anything at all, they're gonna assume we selected option A. Because in this section all the time, or what they'll think is, oh, well, it's not an HOA, I don't have to check any of them. No, you do have to check one of them, but at the end of the day, they're both gonna do the same thing, so it doesn't matter.
Oh, option is, okay, automatic.
Yeah, exactly. So then that is,
On line 189, it also specifies, does not include a condominium or the homeowners.
yeah. Exactly.
I love the commission one too.
Because you had to contribute.
Representing the seller, and it was at the beginning, I was representing the seller and I didn't read it, you know, you don't read it. And I was like, oh no, I put seller here, so I'm good. I was not good, because in the addendum, he had put seller, seller was gonna pay, even though I had told him that he was gonna pay. So because he put seller on the condominium, I was out, yeah. So I always, whenever I go over the address, I'm like, guys.
Make sure. So a lot of that is what I'm saying, like, you start getting mechanical about things, right? You're like, oh, whatever, yeah, I told him that his buyer was gonna pay, it doesn't matter, and then you don't double check the addendum, and then they screw you on the addendum, and you're like, well, now what? And a lot of times you do, you have to contribute or try to figure it out.
Information and on top of that,
Bueno, so those are the things you have to like, you have to look out for, because we get used to filling out these forms and seeing them so often that sometimes you're like, oh, I know what this section means, and you check off a box and you didn't take the time to actually, you know, really exactly see how it was gonna affect your client. One of the ways that I always tell people about that is in West Palm and south of Miami-Dade, generally now the Keys is like half and half, but there used to be a time where only Dade and Broward buyer selected and buyer paid for title. Everywhere else, the seller selected the title company, but the seller paid for the title insurance policy. And I had a time where I had an agent who was working in West Palm a lot, and he was submitting offers. Buyer selects title and buyer pays for the title insurance policy. And I had one of those realtors that told me that she'd been doing this for 25 years, blah, 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 blah. Tell me that she was not gonna accept the offer because the realtor had selected buyer selects, buyer pays. And I'm like, okay, perfect. You and your 25 years of experience, you've been doing this longer than I've been alive. But let me ask you a question. How does it hurt your client that my buyer is taking over an expense that would normally be your client? No, that's not the way we do things here, blah, 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 blah. She made us change it. And what did she do, guys? She made her seller take on an expense that the buyer was offering to cover. I still don't understand where that lady's head was that day. But she gave me a lecture that I didn't know how to fill out a contract because of that. And so that's, again, another story I tell people. I'm like, just because she's been doing it like that way for 25 years, you move the little checkbox and then she doesn't know what the hell's going on.
It's always
Read it.
25 years.
Huh?
It's always 25
It's
years.
something weird about that.
It's the weirdest thing. Because today somebody just told me that. I was like, some lady told me. Some lady. I've been doing rentals for 25 years. already.
And over there, buyer, a seller pays,
Talk to me,
seller
yeah.
selects seller pays, what percent, like, you know, when I picked up the listing, I did it. And sound like, you know, and I said your closing costs are about 1.5, what percent is it?
So it depends on your purchase price, but your title insurance policy is generally gonna be no more than $3,000 unless it's a huge transaction.
Oh,
So,
so it's like 3 Gs.
yeah, that's like a $500,000 or $600,000 deal. The lower it is, I mean, normally it's somewhere between 1 and 3, and then the bigger deals you're gonna see above 3 for what they're paying. But title can always do the estimate for you. So like if you reach out to your title company or your attorney, they should be able to tell you, how does it affect my closing costs if we switch?
Reach out to you when I'm still not in my contract.
So that's something that you can also explain, and there was a time where down here in, South Florida, that was a way that they were also trying to negotiate that. In counties where normally the seller would select title and pay for title, in that crazy market, we're like, we'll pay your title. And that's saving your buyer whatever amount of money. Sometimes you have to educate that realtor on the other side, because again, they're not used to it. They go crazy and they're like, oh my God, what are you doing to me? But at the end of the day, it can be like, that's a $3,000 saving for your buyer, your seller, like, let my buyer take over title or whatever the case is. It's a negotiation point when the market is crazy. Do we have any other questions?
No.
Okay.
Okay.
So that was a special assessment. The other thing is line 260. I'm arguing with a realtor right now who told me that you cannot cancel a contract during the inspection period unless there's a problem with the property.
What?
During the inspection period, you can cancel a contract because I don't like the color of the paint anymore.
Yeah.
That's it.
Yeah.
I don't want them.
The mailbox is a little too crooked for my taste. Done. Like there's
You
no
don't even have to
excuse.
give a reason.
You don't have to give a reason.
No, with the inspection, you can do whatever you want.
So we're arguing about this now. He's threatening to keep the buyer's escrow deposit when we let him know during the inspection period that we wanted to get out of the contract. Again, one of those realtors that has been around longer than I've been alive, and so I don't know what I'm doing, even though I have a law degree. It's all good. But whatever number you put on here is also important for that same reason. It's another bright line rule, like we talked about. If you miss that day, especially on a cash contract, there goes your escrow deposit. If it's not a cash transaction, it doesn't matter. It's not a big deal because you have other reasons with, during the financing contingency to get out of the contract. That's that. People always ask me, Claudia, there's an issue with the contract. What do we do now? Go to lines 354. Whenever you guys have this problem, you call me. I always tell you the first thing to do. And the first thing is you sending an email. And the email says, if you don't do X by whatever date, the next email you're gonna get is gonna be from my attorney. And believe it or not, a lot of times that goes a done. And then your clients don't have to pay me, they don't have to hire me, and you're the hero. I don't care that you guys are the hero. I like to be behind the scenes. If your clients are happy, you guys are gonna get repeat business. And if you guys get repeat business, I get repeat business. So that's really what I like to do. At the end of the day, though, sometimes that email just doesn't work. Like with my friend today, the one that says, if you don't give me X by whatever date, I'm gonna get my realtor, or I'm sorry, I'm gonna get my attorney involved.
Which line?
Oh, line 354, huh?
What was X?
If you don't get me the fully executed release and cancellation by close of business on Friday, Monday morning, you're getting an email from my attorney.
355?
354.
What
So,
other scenarios would you use that in?
an extension. If you don't get me the executed extension, so sometimes when like they don't provide access to property during COVID, nobody will let you go do the inspection or whatever. The delay in the inspection has caused me a delay in whatever. And so then if they refuse to sign, they're like, no, we're not gonna give you additional time to get your loan or whatever. Then we'll be like, okay, no problem. Well, if you don't send me the fully executed extension based off your delay, my attorney is gonna be the next one to email you. And a lot of people really do crap their pants when they hear that. And I think it's funny, but sometimes you're like, oh shit, let me not let it escalate to that point. And so then you get what you want, you're done, and your client doesn't need me. In the event that doesn't happen, Jen, another thing, the probate. These assholes that we just dealt with, they refuse to sign something we need them to sign. And I was like, if you guys don't give it to me by tomorrow at the end of the day, I'm gonna be suing you. And of course, they ran. I have talked to them on the phone several times, but for some reason, once I put it in an email and they were able to visualize it. Yeah, so those are the kind of things, but a lot of times I tell you guys, send that email first. Look and see if it works.
Claudia, what's your number?
My number is 305 Claudia.
Hey.
So those are the kind of things that, sometimes you can get your client out of it, but if you can't, this is the section that basically tells us what we have to do. A lot of the times what you have to do is basically send a demand letter. And that demand letter is basically gonna say, like I said, literally what you guys wrote. The difference is it's gonna be on my letterhead, it's gonna be a little bit longer, and it's gonna have my little signature at the bottom. And then people generally do start running and start, because the threat becomes more real, right? Especially for people that are just fostering, that are just trying to play hard to get, or whatever the case may be. Once it's like you hired an attorney, that's it. They're like, oh crap, this really is gonna go to litigation. Let me like not take it there or whatever. And another super important thing, when you guys decide to work with an attorney, depending on whatever kind of case you guys have going on, make sure your attorney actually litigates, actually goes to court. Because that's another thing. If I get a demand letter on behalf of a seller and I'm representing the buyer, and I get a demand letter and they're like, I'm gonna sue you tomorrow. And I'm like, dude, you haven't filed a lawsuit in 20 years. You're not gonna sue me. So then you know that the demand letter is just basically them trying force to see exactly who plays chicken first. That's basically what I tell people. I'm like, no, we're gonna wait. We're gonna see if they actually file. So this is basically what you have to do. You have to send a demand letter. If they ignore your demand letter, then you have to invite them to mediation, because that's exactly what we want to do with these people. Sit in the same room and like discuss the failure of this contract. And then if they ignore both of those letters, then we can file a lawsuit, and we can basically do different things depending on whether it's a lawsuit only for the escrow deposit. So in the case of a seller, if the buyer doesn't make it to closing, and then, you know, they won't sign the release and cancellation, a lot of times the seller will file against the buyer to force them to release the escrow deposit. But more commonly, the seller is normally the one being sued because they somehow refuse to make it to the closing table. So if you guys ever have a buyer where the seller's like, I'm not closing, I'm not closing, I'm not closing, it's called a lawsuit for specific performance to force them to sell according to the terms of the contract itself. Another mistake I see a lot of people make is on line 413, and this one ties in with paragraph 8B that we talked about when there is a tenant on the property. If there is a tenant on the property, you don't just put it on the contract and forget about it. There are certain things that need to be done. We need to confirm how much rent is being paid. We need to confirm if the rent has always been paid on time. We need to confirm if you still have the full security deposit or last month, or if you have a security deposit or last month. There's a number of things that we need to confirm, and the buyer needs to be okay with those things before proceeding to closing. So if you represent the seller on a transaction where there is a tenant on the property, you need to send out a tenant estoppel. The tenant estoppel is a form that confirms those things that I just talked about, how much the rent is, when the lease ends, if there's not a lease, that they're month to month, and those kind of details. If you are the buyer's agent, you don't really care at what point that gets exchanged, and I'll tell you why. Because if you receive that and you do not like the information on there, you can cancel the contract within 5 days of receiving that tenant estoppel. So if you are a buyer's agent, you want the tenant estoppel because you want to know the information. You want to make sure this tenant is like up to date, isn't behind, those kind of things, right? But you're not necessarily in a rush to get the tenant estoppel, and you don't generally follow up on the tenant estoppel, and here's why. Because within 5 days of you receiving the tenant estoppel as a buyer or a buyer's agent, you can cancel the contract for any reason and get out and get your money back.
So as a listing agent, you better jump on that estoppel by it.
Yeah, during the inspection period, here you go, this is what it
You
is.
think there's nothing wrong with the estoppel? They've been paying on time the whole time, like.
I don't feel like it. Done. I was expecting this to be a 100-year lease. Whoops, please cancel. Stupid, but yeah, you don't need a reason. I didn't like the estoppel. The tenant's handwriting bothers me.
Wow.
You have to not be satisfied with the information in the estoppel. And a lot of times, guys, clearly the buyer knows there's a tenant. You probably already discussed what they pay for rent. You probably already discussed what the issue is as far as like the day that they're leaving or what time, you know, the contract expires. So if everything is fine, in the majority of circumstances, your buyer is going to move forward. Obviously, if you get the tenant estoppel and they haven't paid May, there is no security deposit, there's no last month, and you know there's significant damage to the property, obviously your buyer would probably be like, thank you, no thank you, I'm moving on.
I don't request estoppel.
The association estoppel. I don't generally get involved in the tenant estoppel, but I do send you guys a form and I'm like, you guys need to get this signed, and then the timelines are up to you guys.
No, I was just gonna say how we don't do a transaction like that. I don't remember John Farrell, the property in Fort
Of
Lauderdale.
course I do.
He took it upon himself and when I talked to the tenant,
Yep,
because the owner of the property. couldn't-
refused.
Yeah,
So that's the thing, right? At some point, you need this information. The reason is, especially if there's a loan, which was part of the problem that we had there, you have to put these things on the CD. If there is a security deposit, the seller has to transfer the security deposit to the buyer so that when the tenant moves out, the buyer has the money to give back to the tenant or claim or whatever. The same thing with the last month. If the seller is holding a last month, you want the buyer to be able to have the last month to apply it to the last month. So these things go on your CD or on your HUD, especially when there's a lender involved. You're going to want for the buyer to have that information and to provide it to the lender before closing. Because a lot of the times those credits can trigger different things, trids, redisclosures, things like that. So you don't want to wait till the last day. But if you think it's a rocky transaction, you're not sure how the financing is going, blah, blah, blah. Wait. And then worst case, you can be like, hey, by the way, that tenant estable looks a little too ugly for me, and you get out.
What about the post office?
That's completely different. So the post occupancy is generally something that has to be told to somebody before closing. I've had a lot of people that what they do is they just go and they check off the post occupancy, which is now you on the riders or the addendums to the contract. And I literally have had people use that as their post occupancy.
Would you go down there?
Just the checkbox?
No, I mean, with the one pager.
Oh, the one page.
Guys, the post occupancy is not the one pager. So what the one pager does, the one pager, what it does is it says or it specifies the terms that we're gonna agree to, right? So like, there's gonna be a post occupancy for 15 days and it's gonna cost $500 or whatever the case may be.
But I think it's not there that you provide a lease, you have like a certain amount of time that you provide a lease.
You have to provide something after that. I've had people close with that as a post occupancy and then exactly, and that's fine as long as nothing happens. But then when something happens, you usually guys as the seller, especially if you guys represent the, as the buyer, you guys want to make sure that they're not going to open holes in your wall when they're moving out and that your buyer now has to take this property with the holes in the wall because the closing already happened. The buyer's already the owner of the property. The same thing. Go ahead.
So I had a bit of an issue with that too. So if you put the in the broker remarks and the MLS post occupancy, like seller will need or request 2 months post occupancy and the MLS, but it's nowhere in the contract, then it doesn't matter, right?
There's no post occupancy.
So when do you like, okay, so the buyer sends you the offer, the buyer sends you the contract, and it's not in there, do you counter with it, or do you ask him to send it to you right there before you even?
I usually reply. That's what I would do. And I'd be like, hey, thank you for your offer. Per the broker remarks, the seller requires a 2-month post occupancy. Please add the post occupancy addendum. And then they will literally check off you. And it's a 1-pager that basically says like the post occupancy is going to be for X number of days, blah, 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 blah. And then your title company or your attorney has to prepare a separate post occupancy agreement. And that post occupancy agreement is a separate agreement that has those same terms, but it usually has a security deposit. We usually put the specific time by which they have to be out on that day because people get creative. And then if you work with my office, we do a $500 a day penalty for every day you stay beyond the post occupancy from the security deposit that we're already holding. So guess what? People usually move out early. Beautiful.
Do you do a final walkthrough and then a final walkthrough?
So that's exactly, and that's something else that the post occupancy agreement says. So one of the things it says is that you're not creating a landlord tenant relationship so that if they overstay the post occupancy, you don't have to evict them. They're not a tenant. And the other thing is that we put that once the possession is transferred back to the owner, that they both have to send title and email confirming that the security deposit can be released. Or if there's any claims to be made against that security deposit, what they would be. So again, a lot of the times when the seller is the one that's doing the post occupancy, which is the only reason why you would have a post occupancy in the first place, seller hasn't moved out. And I mean, you guys have seen properties after people move out, sometimes they're a shit show. And we want to make sure that you're able to, you know,
What if
make
I'm
up for.
waiting the contract to the term?
You can do it too, as long as buyer and seller agree. You should always do an addendum because people flip flop, they change their minds. Something happens on their transaction, they get pissed and they're like, okay, well, you're not getting a post occupancy anymore, like little kids, right? But if you know that you're gonna need one, you approach the other side, you do your post occupancy addendum, like any other addendum after, you know, you've already been under contract. And then at closing, title will also be the one to put over the actual. They don't have to agree to anything that wasn't in the original contract.
But I always try to do it at the beginning, if we can.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, when we all like each other, when we're all excited and we want to get this deal done and the seller is dying to get his money in his bank account and the buyer is already seeing him sleeping in the house, that's the perfect time to do any of these things or to ask for any of these modifications. Because later on, yeah, people will get-
15 days in is a problem.
yeah, if it were. So that's basically, I think, the majority of it. One thing that I always tell my agents is on this very last page, guys, where you're going to see your listing and cooperating broker. Always put your percentages. Always put your percentages.
I used to think that was so tacky.
No, you'd be surprised what people do when you don't put your percentages on there. So put your percentages next to your name. Put your percentages next to your name, and then the other thing is you guys also have to put in the additional terms. This is a new problem that's starting to happen. Water accounts will be closed out. All water accounts will be paid and closed out. Yes.
Seller will close whatever water.
Yeah.
I have a question about that commission part, but what if it's something different on the MLS?
Well, that's exactly why you need to do that.
So
There's a
what,
lot of schools of thought here. Don't quote me on it, but
so which one they will take? They will take what's on the MLS?
I'm gonna argue it's this one because it came after the MLS. And there's a number of reasons why.
Yeah.
you-
No, it's MLS to supersede.
Yeah, but
Yeah, MLS supersedes this, the commission.
They changed that.
so that's exactly what happens. So the reason why, number one, when you guys go to a listing appointment, you guys should have the MLS sheets printed out or saved somewhere for each client from the day that you guys went and showed the property, because I've had people that have gone to closing, there's no percentages here, and then all of a sudden they're making 1%. Like, I would not have shown this property if I was making 1%. So that's one of the reasons why I recommend that my agents do that. The other reason is there's different reasons why you would put a different number here than the MLS. Generally, if the MLS has 3, don't put 4 next to your name. You're gonna pick up a fool, like, hello. But if there's a reason why you got your offer accepted because of 2%, you guys should put it on there. So in this crazy market that we just had, sometimes the buyer's agent only charging 2% was an incentive to the seller to give you that contract because they were netting more money. So you should always put it on here. A good listing agent who receives an offer that has a wacky number here is gonna point it out to you right then and there. It's probably gonna counter with it, but it's another thing similar to the timeline. Hash it out at the beginning. And then a lot of times I've had realtors where they're like, oh, I'm getting 2%. The other side's getting 2% too. Haha. You're getting 2%, they're getting 4% because they're still charging 6%. So those kind of things, you air them out at the beginning of the transaction, especially if you put your fees here, and then people can get funny with your
I guess
percentages.
the question, I represented a seller once, and the buyer's agent sent me a contract, we were paying 5%, like, 2.5, and he put 3% non-negotiable. There, like, next to his name,
That's hilarious.
and I was like, no, I mean, my seller was like, okay, whatever, I don't care, but I was like, I had never seen that before.
You're not obligated.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
I would have loved to be like, buy something.
I wanted to be like, no, but my seller was like, yeah.
It doesn't matter, just go. Yeah, I mean,
Can we do that if we're recommending a buyer? Can we, like, if I'm gonna say 60%, I could write 50, I'm not.
And see what
is your deal gonna get accepted?
So,
Yeah.
so you know what, have you guys closed?
We closed, it was a cash deal, like my seller was like, yes, I'll pay a 3%.
Worth it.
And he paid 3%, so I was like, all right, whatever.
I had a listing agent pay me 2.5 and she got 3.5.
Oh, people do that. People do that. That's a part of the reason why I tell people to do that too, because
You do that. That's a lot of time. Then I was 4% off and then
2% the other side, yeah. It's worth it. You guys are moving the property. It's worth
So
it.
question, so say like, I put 3%, and then with the MLS say 2%, right? And then,
We're to argue. It's gonna be an argument.
but who does, so the contract, who knows, because I have.
So nothing in law is black and white. And like I said, very minor details.
Such a lawyer.
Not see the contract when it was presented to you with the 3%, and why did you not bring it up and what, so.
So and if they sign, so okay.
What I also have the agent do is print that, like, the MLS sheet along with the contract, so like send the contract and the MLS sheet. Where everything should be there, commission, like, so if there's any dispute, it's like, and then the print out should have the date on the
It
bottom.
does, yeah. So then if If anything, people change it after the fact, or after they know that they got an offer, they go in there and they change it, yeah. So that's the way for you to protect yourself.
My only day,
As I go back.
Now I know.
Now it's common. It's a very common thing. I mean, we're stretching, at least we're not doing what we're.
At least, right? Or 1.5.
I say that to 1.5%.
You send them a contract, you can send on.
and the house is listed for 300 days.
You have to disclose that you're pocketing for and giving to, you know. In the MLS where it says like, to this is transaction, and the other one is.
Cooperating
Exactly,
or listing.
transactional, like, you don't have to put your commission.
You put the.
And it, whatever's on the listing agreement, it will override.
Exactly.
I mean, so yeah.
Like,
Maybe 2.5, 3.5, little by little.
that one agent came after us and he
Oh,
said,
that's
well,
so-
let me see your percentage. And I was like, no.
Well, they'll see
Yeah, but they-
it, right?
But they see it also here.
Yeah, you're gonna see it on the HUD or the CD
you
at some
see it,
point,
yeah.
and it's gonna come out.
Right?
And you want the house or not?
We're paying 2 period.
Yeah.
Non-negotiable, non-negotiable.
I'm so bossy, I can't believe it. The water accounts that we were talking about, so the water accounts, the reason why it's important is that most of the time, water accounts, you can't lien a property because of a water account unless it's an owner's water account. So specifically, if the property has ever had tenants that had the water under their own individual names, there might be outstanding balances from the tenants that they never paid. And you can't lien the property for it, but that balance follows the property. Every time we pull a lien search, I mean, I've had them with like $1,000 of outstanding water bills. And so some people are just like, no, I want the seller to pay their closing. And I'm like, well, they're not legally obligated to unless you add the language. Specifically now, there are certain municipalities and cities, Pembroke Pines is one of them, that when the buyer goes to open their account, if there's any balance, they can't open the account. I'm like, that's fucked up because the seller is not obligated to pay it, but then they start calling me and they're like, oh, well, you didn't collect it. I'm like, I didn't have to because it wasn't. So to avoid that issue, because all the little cities and counties are getting a little bit more intelligent about the fact that, you know, they have to pay it. It's always put that the seller agrees to close out any outstanding water accounts and balances at the time of closing. So it includes any tenant accounts that might still be lingering.
Yeah.
If I'm the buyer's agent in my offer, yeah, that's where I will put it. Questions, comments, concerns?
I have one more question.
Go for it.
So that nightmare guy that charged the client the $10,000. Okay, well, I actually tried to get into contact with him last year on another property, and I was representing the buyer there. And we went under contract. I asked for the seller's disclosure, but he didn't want to give it to me because I didn't check the box, right? So now obviously I checked the box and let everybody know whatever, but we're working a transaction and the lender is asking for the seller's disclosure because it's on
The
the
contract.
contract now. Wouldn't that, like, if there's something negative on the seller's disclosure, can it hurt the loan?
100%.
So it's like, there's no way around it.
The lender has to do his due diligence to make sure there's not some crazy shit on the property that's not disclosed. Yeah, So
you
that's what
want
happens.
$3,000 in the contract?
You have to put it on the little cajita, you know, that says other. You have to put seller's disclosure, not that I'll give it to you.
Legally in Florida, it's not required.
So with
What's the point? Like, you can lie on that.
Yeah, but you have this, that's why you have the inspection, in my opinion, like inspection is gonna tell you what you need to know.
Not necessarily. There's other issues that you want to. Exactly.
Yeah, but- You say, I don't know, I don't know.
Yeah, but you ask for it.
Like, when an agent never got you.
Oh, no, listen, I'm telling you, if you don't know, you don't.
Pero if it's trouble, then the loan, ya sea.
It could be an issue. The law is that you cannot make an omission as a seller when you're selling a property about certain things that you have to disclose. So a lot of people will tell you the seller's disclosure is not required. But I mean, they can't just give it to you and lie because then you can sue them for lying on the seller's disclosure.
I don't recall.
Anything, they have to be shown when they fill out the seller's disclosure. That's fine.
Question, if that property, that $10,000 fine that you have to pay, I showed the property to one of my buyers. My buyer's super interested in the buyer. The listing agent is
MIA.
a dude. Is there any way that, she even said, she's like, I messed up, I said, this is the agreement, I'm stuck for like a year. Is there any way that not that I can convince her, because she kind of wants to get out of the contract, is there any way that, since I already showed the buyer, Jennifer can list the property? I told her it's procuring cause, like we showed it during the time that he is the listing agent.
But
So
Jennifer
I
never
can-
showed the property.
But I'm sure he's in a couple protection period, he already knows. what the
They're doing some
buyer-
Miami, they're doing some Miami. You going to our mobile? I don't, there's a Zoom live. This is not protected by attorney-client.
Okay, getting out of the contract, have Jennifer have the buyer. You can't be like,
This attorney-client doesn't count no more.
That's insane. Dude, let me send it to my.
sorry,
When did he list it?
not too long ago.
Like January?
Yeah, for real.
Send me a listing agreement. Send me a listing agreement. I'm gonna argue some crazy shit and see if you just. Sometimes you're wrong and sometimes you send a demand letter and again, people are like, oh shit, an attorney. And then they're like, yeah.
What's his name?
Felipe Carmona.
Ramona's wife, husband?
Yeah.
She didn't like that.
No, that's
No.
You sit here. Let me go.
Send me a listing agreement.
Okay.
The one on the bus bench.
Yeah,
What
the
am I
red
doing
one,
here?
the red
Hey,
one.
Tommy. He's that dude.
Rebecca.
All right, so long story short, you guys need to basically think of who you represent when you're trying to use this contract, right? This contract has really good outs on both ends of it. You guys need to keep those in mind depending on what side you're representing. And even when someone's trying to bullshit you, like I had somebody bamboozle me today on a probate, like I'm an attorney, I know my shit, but sometimes people are like, hey, what about this? And I'm like, oh shit, did I forget? And I'm like, no, I didn't forget. And I asked like my associate, I'm like, yo, Jess, do we need to do this on this case? She's like, no, I question myself sometimes too.
Oh, yeah.
Because people who don't know shit come to me and they're like, oh, you're wrong because of this. And I'm like, oh shit, have I been doing that like the wrong way all this time? Don't let that happen to you. Be confident in what you know. At the end of the day,
Case, they don't need the 30-day judge. And I'm the one that.
No, it's not the judgment.
it's a summary administration. You don't ever need it. On a summary administration, you don't need publication. But that guy literally bamboozled me this morning. I was like, oh my God, I forgot. And then I was like, wait, time out. No, man, I know what I'm fucking doing. The judge signed the orders this afternoon. We have them. We're done.
No petition.
Nothing. Yeah, I'm like,
So I have
They're
a,
ready, the buyers are ready.
but we need, it's gonna be a little complicated because of the guardianship. That's why I keep asking him, updated commitment, hello, hello, and he hasn't. But no. Sometimes people will throw shit at you and you'll be like, oh my God, I've been doing this wrong. But no, be confident in what you know. And if you don't know, call me. Let's like run through it.
How come in this case, because Marcelo's case, we needed for the public.
There were errors.
No, because there were other properties. It wasn't a summary administration, it was a formal administration. So the reason why it's going to probate 101, the reason why you have to do a publication period in a probate is because if there's any creditors that are owed money, they have to be paid. But it's a homestead property. You can exempt every creditor with a homestead property. And so then that was the only asset. There wasn't bank accounts, there wasn't nothing else. They had done everything else right except the freaking property. And so then since that was the only asset and no creditor can do anything against homestead property, we don't have to do anything.
I have a question. So in a sense, I know that for listings, I try to always make sure we work with an attorney for the entire transaction, right? So with buyers, clearly, it's very important to also get you involved too. So how do you recommend that? When do we get you involved? How do we get you to work with us to make sure the buyers are taken care of?
So as a seller, whenever you have an executed contract, you send it to me and I send an email to title from the beginning, letting them know that I'm gonna be doing the seller rep. As a buyer, you can either put me on title and then I don't charge an attorney fee. I just charge a regular closing fee. And if it's a situation where you can't select title for some reason, I can do a buyer rep. The thing with a buyer rep is technically the contract is gonna say that the buyer selected that title company. So the title company is authorized to charge their settlement fee. And my fee is on top of the settlement fee,
And what are your fees as far? Can you disclose it?
$950.
for both sides.
every time, no matter what, seller rep, buyer rep, title, everything, $9.50
All right.
across the board. Any other questions? All right, guys, thanks so much for. No last questions on here on the
A
Zoom?
lot of pitfalls.
A lot of pitfalls.
Oh, wait,
I think there's one.
All right, no, just your, no. Just your Claudia, your info.
Yes, 305-252-8342. That is Club 305 Claudia. You guys can also follow me on Instagram. It's at Claudia C_ESQ. And I like to post like crazy crap that happens, like the $72,000 thing and all that stuff. I post it on Instagram so you guys can learn from other people's mistakes.
Realtor, GC, the sign, they got a GC. The land.
Thank you guys for your time.